Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really specific, two-pronged political playbook that's being proposed right now for the 2026 midterms. We're looking at an extensive strategic outline recently presented by the Promethean PAC. Now, just to be clear up front, as always, our goal here isn't to endorse any political viewpoint. We're just the messengers objectively mapping out exactly how this strategy is constructed. We're going to deconstruct the nuts and bolts of their proposed ground game, and then we'll look at the sweeping macroeconomic messaging they intend to pair with it. If you want to understand the tactical thinking happening behind the scenes right now and why your doorbell might literally be ringing a lot more in the coming years, you are in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to start by picturing a staggering number: 40. According to this strategic presentation, this is the exact number of times a low-propensity voter must be contacted before they can be reliably expected to actually show up on Election Day. That's not 4 times, not 14, 40. This single number forms the absolute bedrock of the tactical approach we're analyzing today, and it implies a level of contact that goes way, way beyond traditional campaigning. So, let's look closer at this in Section 1, the 40 touches rule. The core psychology behind hitting that 40 touch mark is actually pretty fascinating. The strategy flat out argues that having a total stranger knock on your door, it just doesn't move the needle anymore. For this level of intense contact to work, the campaign has to send someone the voter already knows. It needs to be a familiar face, someone who lives in their neighborhood, someone who has already texted them, or maybe someone they've bumped into at the local grocery store. The whole premise is that familiarity breeds compliance when it comes to finally getting someone to the ballot box. And that brings us to the primary target of this massive effort, the low-propensity voter. The presentation defines these folks as registered voters who essentially have to be heavily nudged, herded, and pushed by their local networks to participate. And the PAC highlights that this highly localized, repetitive method isn't just theory. They point to organizations like Turning Point, claiming this exact hyperlocal strategy was instrumental in mobilizing these really hard-to-reach voters during the 2024 presidential race. Let's move right along to Section 2 and see how this builds into an actual organizational structure, the Arizona precinct model. Okay, to pull off 40 contacts per voter and do it with a familiar face, you obviously need a hyperlocal ratio. And here is the magic number the strategy points to for that: 125. The Republican Party model in Arizona aims to have one elected precinct committeeman directly responsible for exactly 125 registered Republicans in their immediate local area. That super tight ratio is what theoretically makes those 40 familiar touches logistically possible for one person to handle. This represents a massive structural and cultural shift for them. The strategy explicitly moves away from the pre-Trump proxy state of a decade ago, where a handful of disconnected party insiders just held hundreds of proxy votes at county meetings. Instead, it demands this new model where committeemen speak directly with their peers. The presentation actually notes that committeemen might have to borderline beg these voters, sitting them down and explaining the severe consequences of staying home. It's a total shift from bureaucratic proxy power to intense, localized engagement. So that's the theory of the ground game, but how do they measure success? Let's look at Section 3, shifting the margins. The really crucial point to understand here is that this strategy isn't always about outright winning a deeply hostile district. It's just about shifting the margins. The PAC uses Wayne County, Michigan, a heavily Democratic area, as their prime example. The historical political math suggests that if a Republican can secure just a few percentage points above a 30% baseline in the specific county, it can mathematically flip the entire state. And according to their presentation, they successfully moved that needle to 33.6% in 2024. To summarize their claimed 2024 successes, they point to a 5.5% shift in Maricopa County, Arizona, alongside that crucial 33.6% threshold in Wayne County. But here's the real kicker they emphasize to their organizers: the context of these wins. The presentation stresses that these margins were shifted strictly by mobilizing unexpected layers of voters using that hyper-local ground game. And they claim it was all done without the passing of the Save America Act and entirely without being in control of the national political apparatus at the time. All right, now we're going to zoom out a bit for Section 4, the economic revolution strategy. We know how they plan to physically contact voters at the doorstep, but what are they actually saying to persuade them? The PAC frames their messaging around a massive ideological battle between two competing economic models. First is what they brand the British imperial or globalist system. They argue this system is designed to protect powerful private central banks and an international oligarchy, essentially ruling over nations to maintain an elite class. The counter to this is what they call the American system. They trace this all the way back to George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, arguing it's a system rooted in human creativity, manufacturing, and growing the physical economic pie for the working class. To make this American system narrative really resonate on a doorstep, they use a very specific historical timeline of economic grievances. They argue that decline of the middle class began in 1971 when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. Next, they point to the 1990s and NAFTA as the killer blow that hollowed out blue-collar workers. Then comes the 2008 financial bailouts, which they view as the absolute peak of globalist failure. According to this strategy, this timeline of working-class destruction went largely unchallenged until 2015, when Donald Trump came down that escalator to try and overthrow the existing system. And this points perfectly to their core critique of the political opposition. The strategy argues that for decades, past policies didn't fix the underlying structure at all. They simply pacified the economic losers of the globalist system. The PAT claims that instead of bringing back production, politicians threw money or cultural distractions at the working class, all while never actually challenging the international oligarchy pulling the strings. This is the exact narrative the local committeemen are instructed to deliver. Let's move to how they adapt this macroeconomic message for Section 5, winning over Gen Z. This is their most crucial target demographic heading into the midterms, disillusioned young voters. And what's really striking here is the empathy the strategy attempts to map out for an 18-year-old voter today. The playbook acknowledges that a Gen Z voter has quite literally never lived in an economy that functioned normally for them. Think about it. They grew up in the shadow of the 2008 crash, had their critical high school or college years totally disrupted by COVID, and then were sold a bill of goods telling them to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt for what the PAC calls nonsensical jobs. Because of that lived reality, the strategy outlines a major pivot in how conservatives should talk to the youth. Simply standing at a door and criticizing socialism or rattling off dry economic facts, it falls completely flat. Gen Z already knows the current system doesn't work for them. Therefore, the strategy asserts that campaigns must validate young voters' frustrations and offer them a brand new identity, not as victims, but as economic producers who get to participate in a massive revitalization of the physical economy. So what does offering that identity of production look like in practice? Well, the strategy arms its canvassers with highly specific localized data to prove this revolution is already underway. Take Arizona, for example. They point to fiscal year 2026 projections showing $19 billion in incoming investments from sectors like mining, energy, and semiconductors. They highlight 26,000 new, tangible, productive jobs with an average wage of $81,000. They even point out a 4,000 skilled labor shortfall in Tucson alone. The whole goal is to show a young person on the doorstep that there is a high-paying, productive role waiting for them right now in this new economy. Which brings us to the ultimate question laid out by this explainer. We've seen the micro-tactics, the 40 touches, and the localized 1 to 125 precinct model. And we've explored the macro narrative, replacing a globalist system with a producer-focused American economy to win over a disillusioned Gen Z. Promethean PAC truly believes this exact synthesis of an aggressive, familiar ground game paired with a sweeping economic vision is the undeniable blueprint for victory. But as we look toward the 2026 midterms, we have to ask, can a strategy that requires this level of intense, sustained, neighbor-to-neighbor commitment actually be executed at scale? It's a fascinating playbook for sure, and only Election Day is going to provide the answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see out there.